you believe all of these gorgeous quilts were made from the same design, the disappearing star? We've just used different fabrics to get a different look. We will be learning the option 2 of the square in a square technique today on Perfecting Patchwork. The quilt that we've chosen to work on today is the Disappearing Star block. It's a great quilt for a beginner to get started with, and we will do option 2 of the square in a square system. The square in a square system means that you don't ever have to cut or sew a triangle, but you get beautiful blocks and beautiful quilts with multiple triangle units in it, doing it the square in a square way. And when you do that, you start with a square in the middle and surround it with strips. But before we get started on the sewing, let's look at where we're going and what the block will look like. Here we've chosen this particular block with the gorgeous red around it, with the buttery yellow and the pastel pinks in the middle. Now you'll see several quilts today that use several different designs, and it's the exact same pattern, just different fabrics. And it's amazing how the different fabrics make the quilts look different, and it also makes the star disappear. Now this fabric is by Moda, and it's called Gingham Rose by the Three Sisters, and we have just chosen to do it as an organized scrap quilt. We've chosen all the different pinks to be in our center, to be our center square, and then all the different yellows to be the surrounding strips. And it really doesn't matter which one's in the center and which one's on the side, as long as you keep the pinks in the centers and the yellow as your strips. So let's go ahead and start sewing our basic square in a square unit. This is the way that we'll want it to look. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is square in the middle with a strip on each side. And I have a special way of chain piecing these in the machine so that they go together very, very quickly. You just start out with your strip, and if it's cut from the yard goods, it'll still have the selvage on the edge, and that's great. We want to use that to help us get going. Then we want to just take our squares that we have cut in all the different flavors of pink and attach those to the side of the strip, making sure that the edge of the square is nice and neat along the edge of the strip, sewing a nice scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now these squares are a little big, so that means that our quilt will go together quickly. That's another reason why this is great for a beginner to work on. Now sew completely through to the end of your square, and then just pick up your next one and attach it to the strip. Now when you're making a large quilt, if you have multiple different pieces you're trying to sew around it and get lots of different color in it, you can still go ahead and sew squares on the same strip, and then just when you go around with your other sides, it's easy to incorporate the other fabrics to keep it scrappy. Now this one here has a gorgeous red rose on it. This will really look so nice in the center of our option 2s. So just continue adding your squares to your strips until you have all the squares that you need, or you run out of a strip. Now if you still have some strip left and you're complete, then all you have to do is just sew through the end of the square and then just snip it off right where it's at. Now we want to sew on side 2. You can see over here how we have the squares sewn on the strips, and we just continue on for the length of the strip. Then the next step is to go to the opposite side and sew a strip, and in this sample here you can see how we just continue to sew the side 2 on all the way across the end. And the way that you do that is, once again, you start your strip in the machine, and then you'll pick up your option 1s that you have. Now if you're taking them directly off the back of the machine, you want to make sure that right where you're holding on to it and you make your clip to separate it, that this is the piece that you start first on your strip. If you try to go to the end of the strip, you'll have it turned on backwards and might be sewing the wrong side to the right side. This way we still have the right sides of the fabric together, just like always, just like normal, and continue to sew your squares on your strips all the way through the square. Now you don't have to try to fight with your pieces and open these up. Just leave them laying right nice and neat along the edge. And you'll notice that we have about a finger space in between the squares before we start the new square. We just need enough room to separate them. We don't want too much in between. Continue to do this for as many squares as you need for the quilt that you're working on. And you can also substitute these center squares. You'll see one of the quilts that we've put a 4 patch in the center instead of using a solid square in the same disappearing star, and it really gives a lot more action and movement in the quilt. So continue sewing for as many squares as you need, and if you still have some strip left over, just go ahead and snip the edge of that fabric off. Now if I wanted to take all of this out of the machine to do my trimming and my pressing, I would want to put the little scrap runner piece in. I like to always leave something in my machine. Then I know that my bobbin and my upper threads are going to stay right where they need to be. And then just separate these out of the machine. Now you're ready to cut these apart and press. And so you can do that with your scissors, or you can do it with your rotary cutter. Let's just move this one over a little bit. Now if you have any extra edges on the end of it, you want to go ahead and just trim those up a little bit closer and just go right through separating your pieces. Now if you want to use a ruler to lay down to separate your pieces so that you can get it nice and straight, you can. But the point of all of it is just to separate. You can see how that if you had too much in between there, how you would have extra fabric that was unnecessary. So just trim those up. Now when you get these all completed, you want to press them open, and when I say open, I mean you're opening up the strips on the square and pressing like this. So that means that your seams will go out towards the strip and that your center square will lay flat on there. After you have sides 1 and 2, you're ready to attach a short strip on each side for side 3 and 4. And let's see what those pieces look like as we do that. We'll just move these over here out of the way. Okay, now this is what it looks like when we have all 4 sides sewn on the block. And then of course this is the piece that it looks like when we have it all trimmed up using the square and a square system with the 90 right in the tip. See how we get triangle units from each one of these strips that we have sewn on the side of the square. So we want to just take our pieces where we have side 1 and 2 on and attach a short strip to each side. Now when you have these little extra edges coming off because we just separated those units, when you get ready to start this in the machine, make sure the edge of your foot is starting so that it will line up with the edge of your square, because that's where all of our seam allowance and our sizing comes from. So you can see how I'm starting the square in the machine first, and see how my foot will just continue to come down and be perfect with the edge of the square. Now we want a short strip to be sewn on each side, and the strip must be at least long enough to cover the square. This one is actually quite a bit longer than what we really need. It just needs to cover the square a little bit. So if our square, like this one, it's large, it's probably about 5 inches, you would want your strip to be half of that plus a fourth. So that would be about 2 3/4 inches for the width of the strip that you need, and the length would need to be about 5.5 inches if our square is 5. If we cut the length exactly the same size as the square, then we have to make sure when we're laying it on the square, like we are here, that it's exactly on the square. But if we make it a little bit bigger, then we don't have to take the time to do it. We can just lay it down on there and sew. Now when we place the ruler on here to trim it up, the square and a square tool, it'll trim off all of these extra edges that we don't need. So if you're really stingy with your fabric and you don't want to use any extra than what you need to, just make that strip long enough to cover the square plus a little bit more. See how this one goes all the way to the edge? It's not necessary for it to do that. Then you'll just turn it around and sew down side 4, and you'll have your completed block that looks like this. Now let's go ahead and trim it using the square and a square tool to get our triangle units out of our basic square. When you have the square in the middle and the strips on each side, this is the basic square. And from this basic square, you can trim any of the square and a square triangle units that we call options. And we have 20 available right now at this time. So 20 different triangle units all come from this one basic square. To trim it like this, leaving the 1/4 of an inch off of each tip, we want to just place the tip of our 90 right in the tip of that sewn square. We want to make sure that the black lines go right down over the seam and that our grid line floats and goes right through the tip. Now sometimes when people call an email, some of their questions are, the size of my unit was not correct. What did I do wrong? Well, there's 3 places where all of your sizing comes from. First of all, from the size of that center square. Did you really cut the center square correctly? If it said to cut it 5 inches, did you cut it 5? Did you cut it a healthy 5, meaning just a little bit big? Or did you cut it a skinny 5 inches, meaning a little bit small? That will change the size of the square. The next thing that changes the size of the square is your seam allowance. Did you sew it too wide? It'll make your block small. If you sew it too skinny, it'll make it big. And when you sew on all four sides, if they're not consistent, then that will turn your square into a rectangle or a unit that doesn't have all four sides being the same. So the second place you need to watch for proper measurement and would be your seam allowance, a scant 1/4 of an inch. The scant 1/4 of an inch is just a shadow or a thread smaller than a regular 1/4 of an inch. Now the third way that you can change the size of your square is by the way that you place the tool on here. First of all, do you have the proper trimming? Some of the options are trimmed a little bit differently than this right here with the 90 in the tip. But even with the 90 in the tip, see how if you push it out just a little bit, see how that'll make the block big? Or if you pull it in a little bit towards the center square, that'll make your block a little bit smaller. So it's not too hard to change the size of your block to trim it small or large, which can work for you or against you depending on how you sew and what you need. But if you're standing up to make your cuts and your ruler, the lines are right over the seam and the tip of the 90 right in the tip of the square, then that will give you your perfect measurements. And if you've done a good job with your cutting of your squares and the sewing of your seams, then this should be right smack on top. But if you have messed up a little bit with your cutting and sewing and you need to make it a little bit bigger because your seam allowance was too big, you can just push it out just a little bit away from that center square. And by the time you just move it a thread or two on all four sides, you can increase that block size by a considerable amount or decrease it. So here we're going to make the trim with the 90 right in the tip, trimming it up. And you can see how that will leave your perfect 1/4 of an inch right off of the tip. Continue to turn and trim, and that will give all four corners the perfect 1/4 of an inch. Now sometimes people will see these little edges that we're cutting off and think that we're wasting fabric. And what you want to do with those little tips are limited to your own imagination. They're great for snippets, and you can use it to sew on a smaller square if you'd like to. But my idea of wasted fabric is that all of those unfinished projects that you have in boxes under your beds and in your closets, that's a whole lot more than this little piece that I'm cutting off. And when you think about it, why did you not finish that project? You've lost your enthusiasm over it because either number one, it wasn't looking the way you wanted it to, so you thought, why should I spend any more time with it when the results aren't what I'm looking for? Or maybe you just got bored with it because it wasn't moving along quickly enough. With the square and a square technique, you'll get nice, perfect, accurate points and blocks, and therefore you're excited to keep working on your project, and so you won't have any unfinished projects. Also, do you look at your cup being half empty with these little pieces over here, or is your cup half full with a nice perfect block right here that motivates you and excites you to keep working on that quilt? Now after we have all of our blocks trimmed just like this with the 90 right in the tip, leaving the 1/4 of an inch off of all four sides, we're ready to sew strips on it again and turn it into the option 2 and make our final block. So don't go away, we'll be right back. Okay, now we're back and we have our completed square just like this with a strip on each side that's turned into a triangle unit. Now the next step is to think about this as a new square. I think everyone would agree with me that it's still a square. We've just got another square inside of it. Now we want to take this unit and sew a strip on each side just like we did before. It will look just like this unit here when we get it completed. See, here it is right in the middle, and we have sewn another strip on each side. Now because our square is bigger, we now have wider strips that go on, and remember the length only has to be long enough to cover the actual square that's in the middle, which is now our new square. So we would take the strip and put it in the machine and sew the squares on top just like we have before, just like this, and continue to sew the squares, leaving about a finger in between, just like we did before, and continue and put as many on the strip as we can get on there or as many as we need for the project that we're working on. Now after we have side 1 sewn on, we want to take this and put it in the machine with side 2. So let's go ahead and do that just a little bit here. Let's take a long strip of fabric. Let's start it in our machine just like we did when we had the square by itself with the strips. Now we have the new square. And so we just start the strip in the machine a little bit, and we'll take that square and put it right on the edge of the strip, sewing right along just like we did before, making sure the edge is perfectly on there. Now when we start putting the options on the square, because this is now an option because we've trimmed it up with the square and a square tool, and we're in the process of creating an option 2, we want to make sure that we sew with the stiletto and use that to manipulate and hold our fabric. I don't use any pins, I just use the stiletto so that I can make every bit of it perfect, and the pen doesn't dictate to me or the fabric the results that I get. Now when I go through the intersection here where the strips were sewn on the square, I want to hold all of those thicknesses with my stiletto, and that's why I want to use a stiletto and not a pin or a little plastic stick or even a seam ripper, because I want to pierce through all of those layers of fabric and just slowly feed it through the machine so that I know that I'll get that perfect point. And I even go just a scant inside. When you're sewing that scant 1/4 of an inch, it'll be just a hair bit inside, so when we cut this and open it up to press it, we haven't lost any of the point in the pressing and in the turning, because there's quite a few thicknesses there. So you don't want to go exactly through that intersection, and just continue to sew all of those pieces in there, and you'll have side 2 and side 1 sewn on your center square. Then you'll want to separate those just like we did when it was a smaller unit. Press it. Once again, we want the strips to go out and that seam to go towards the strip. And after we have that, we're ready to sew side 3 and 4 on our block. Let's just go ahead and look at that here. Here we have side 1 and 2 on. Now we want to put a shorter strip on each side. Now when we do that, our unit will look like this with a short strip on each side. And we continue to do that to the other side so that we have all 4 on there. After we have that completed, we're ready to trim up our block, and we want to put the tip of the 90 right in the tip of that unit just like we did before. So using our large square and a square, we'll put the tip of the 90 right in the tip of the square. Those black lines will go right over the seam just like this, and you'll leave that 1/4 of an inch off of the tip. Now if your piece is big and you're afraid to do that little judgment on the end, just butt another ruler up next to it to make your final cut. When you have all 4 of those trimmed exactly just like this with the 90, just like we did on the beginning with the yellow piece, you'll have your 4 red triangles on each side. And this is the option 2. Remember that you'll sew your solid block right next to it. And I don't ever cut these solid blocks until I have this block completed so that I can make it the perfect size to fit on there. This is option 2 of the square and a square technique. You have got 8 triangles in this square, and you didn't have to cut or sew any of them using the square and a square technique. It'll perfect your patchwork the only way.